Are we recording? Yes, we're recording. All right, Louis, Dana, this is for you and any other absent students in further classes today. So what we're going to do today is, as it says right here, we're going to simply review the fall of the Qing, and then go into the ROC, and then do a focus on Mao. At this point, you do want to take notes. Why? A, it clarifies stuff. B, if you didn't catch what's, some deeper interesting meanings or angles, ways to look at this stuff, again, you do have an interview that you have to give, and clearly East-West relations, this is key and fascinating, because this is the collision of two cultures and the fall of one as a result. There is no more epic moment in world history than the oldest civilization on the planet falling to the youngest civilization on the planet. I've had the luxury of being able to think about it for 5 years, and you haven't, so I hope that you're interested in some of the things that come out of this. Put together a bit of okay, and just to make this all pretty, let's see, view, reading mode. All right, so yeah, I put this together, again, just to underscore to you what I call the drumbeat of humiliation. I'll share this with you. I've already given you one that sort of does this, and that's that entire wave 4 thing, but here is just the century of humiliation. Notice the difference in this one. It goes from 1840, that's the Opium War, 50, 60, 70, all the way up to Republic of China, 1940. I'm sorry, 1950, because it's 1949 is when Mao wins. Rounded off 1950. Dead mid-century, Republic of China, Communist China starts. And so that's 11 decades. It's really more than a century of humiliation. It's 110 years of humiliation from the Chinese point of view. And if you look at how I tried to organize each event in this drumbeat of decade by decade, freaking humiliation after humiliation, then you will see just how astonishing the collapse of the Qing is, the crash of wave 4. You will also see that it doesn't end with the Qing. The crash of wave 4 is the last half of the Qing, less than half, last third of the Qing, and the entire ROC, because the ROC, if you haven't noticed, Jesus, division with warlords, civil war, Japan invades, World War II, civil war again, done. It is a miserable time in Chinese history. And then the rise starts here, the last 63 years, wave 5. So looking at this crash, looking at this drumbeat, Opium War, 1840, Taiping Rebellion starts, 15 years of Jesus' little brother killing 20 to 30 million people. 1860, 10 years, third decade, second Opium War. 1870, the nuns and priests are massacred in Tianjin, and the foreigners demand reparations, indemnity, payment, money for that. Why did they massacre these people? You read about it briefly in the textbook. If anybody's interested, by the way, I've got packets on this stuff that I just didn't have time because this semester has been, thrown off by the problems in Alabama. I've got a 2-page reading about the Tianjin massacre that's just really, really engrossing. But a French diplomat starts shooting people in the streets of Tianjin because they're angry over the orphanage that the nuns are running. And because they're angry over their fears that the nuns are doing bad things to their children, a French diplomat comes out with a gun and just starts shooting at people, Chinese people, right? And then all hell breaks loose. They literally dismember the nuns. They rip them limb from limb. They burn cathedrals. They kill several priests, all sorts of stuff. So this Christian stuff is starting to get really out of hand here. In the 1860s and 70s, also the self-strengthening movement. Let's hire France to help us build a navy. We have never needed a navy in our entire existence. How can we blame the Qing for not having a navy when the East China Sea has never been a source of invasion? When Japan occasionally made messes with their piracy, what did the Ming do? Let's just move all of our towns off the coast in 50 kilometers, right? That's what they did. We don't need to fight the Japanese. We'll just make it hard for them to get off their pirate ships and hike 50 kilometers to plunder, right? Problem solved. They never needed a navy. Well, they realize they do now with the arrival of steam-powered sea barbarians. And they pay the French to build a shipyard in Fujian, or Fuzhou, sorry, and sink their ever-diminishing revenues into trying to build a modern navy. But then France invades, in the 1880s, France invades Vietnam, wants a colony. Vietnam is a tribute partner of the Qing. The Qing is obliged, as son of heaven, big brother in the tribute system, to assist the king of Vietnam. They send troops in because they don't have an army to expel the French from Vietnam. And the French send their navy up coast to, again, in 15 astonishing minutes, just blow the entire shipyard to smithereens. End of our navy, waste of our money. The French we hired to help us build our ships have now destroyed our ships in 15 minutes because we didn't want them colonizing our neighbor state. Japan, 1894, so now we're in the 90s. That happened in the 80s, now we're in the 90s. 10 short years later. Why does Japan have a modern navy? Because Japan in the 1850s saw an American battleship, huge, steam up to its shores with Commodore Perry. And Commodore Perry said, "We want to open trade with you." And Japan knew what happened to China 10 years earlier in the Opium War, when China said no. Japan did not want to modernize. It was a samurai Japan. But it knew that it had no choice. They were being made, in classic Godfather fashion, an offer they could not refuse. This starts the Meiji Restoration, and we're talking about in the 1850s here. So Japan in the 1850s realizes, because of the Opium War, we've got to modernize. 3 decades later of modernization in Japan, they have that modern navy. They invade Korea. Korea, China's tribute partner. We are obliged to protect you, Korea, against the Japanese invaders this time. And Japan uses its modern navy to destroy China. And this is astonishing because never has China been anything but the hegemon, all-powerful, son of heaven empire. And suddenly little Japan beats them. This outrages the Chinese more than anything the Europeans did. Because the pirate dwarfs have beat us in a war? Oh, Qing dynasty, how can you allow that to happen? That's what they call the Japanese pirate dwarfs. And so the Japanese beat the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War. And they start taking bits of Manchuria as part of the peace treaty. And people are starting to get angry all over the place. In 1898, an emperor, as you read, the 100 Days of Reform, the emperor tries to start westernizing, despite the fact that they don't want to. We're going to take on Western education and all sorts of things because we can't win by being Confucian anymore, because these guys are brutal. But this 100 Days of Reform is opposed by conservative Confucian/Manchus who don't want to see China modernize, and so it's cut in the bud. In 1900s, the Boxers come along, and so now let me go on down to the pictures. They're pretty fascinating. And by 1912, so there it is, decade by decade. First of all, just to give you an idea of just how big the Qing dynasty was, look at that. The gray area, that's the Ming. Those of you interested in, America's hobby horse, anti-Chinese issues, of all the things for us to make a big deal out of, let's make a big deal out of Tibet. America loves to make a big deal out of Tibet. It gives us something to criticize and slam China about. I'm not saying that China is right about Tibet. It's a very complex issue. But it's at this point that China does absorb Tibet. They allow the Tibetans to rule in the Tibetans' way. They're very tolerant. They're not dogmatic. The Tibetans had their ways. but they were under Chinese authority, Qing authority at this point. Xinjiang, this is the Muslim area, still today. I don't know how many of you are into the news, but there was recently at Tiananmen Square, in other words in Beijing, right in front of the Forbidden City, a guy, a Muslim guy from Xinjiang, drove his car with 3 people in it. Him, his wife, and his daughter or something. Drove it through a crowd of people in the biggest public square in the world, in front of the biggest palace in the world, the Forbidden City, and drove it through a crowd and killed many people, protesting about China's control of Xinjiang, this Muslim area. Well, Xinjiang has been part of, this is a Silk Road area, so it's long been under either Chinese sort of hegemony or else just absorption. So the Qing's borders are massive. Right? It's the biggest empire except for the Mongols. The biggest. Notice they have Mongolia too. Where is it? Yeah. In the early Qing, it's cool. It's the age of photography. So, you know, this isn't Bubu Jingxin, this is real. Can you turn off that light there and maybe hit one of the top 2 buttons to give you guys some light? So, you know, this is elite imperial traditional China during the Qing, in the age of photography. So it's at least 1860 because that's when I think photography started. You see our concubines playing, oh no, just having tea. I don't know what else they're doing. Are they playing mahjong? Who knows? But all was not well in the Qing. There was a lot of crushing poverty. Why? Because under Kangxi, Qianlong, and Kangxi, the 3 first emperors, the great ones, they were so successful that it's called, they suffered from their own success. Their policies were so successful that prosperity happened and people started making babies and the population exploded. And so suddenly, we couldn't take care of this much larger population. By the mid-1800s, China's population was up to 400 million. 400 billion. You'll remember it was 175 at the beginning, 175 million. So now it's doubled, up to 400 million by mid-Qing. And so you see there's some pretty crushing poverty going on here. Why the poverty? It wasn't just the Qing's fault. With all of the treaties opening up China's interior to Western business, people were put out of work. There were boats that were suddenly much faster because they were shallow-bottomed boats that could transport things much faster, and so suddenly people could not make money as boat transport and so forth. There was a lot of unemployment because of the economic disruption. There was also a lot of poverty because of the Taiping Rebellion. 15 years, it devastated the entire Yangtze Delta. The Yangtze, not just Delta, the entire river valley. The breadbasket of China. And so, yeah, there was crushing poverty. Crushing poverty, why, who cares? That leads to bloody revolution. When you have masses of people poor, soon you have masses of angry poor people who will spill blood. Interesting to see the contrast between our earlier Ming ship and the little Christopher Columbus ship. Think of the flow of history here. The same massive Ming ship, but now we've got this thing. It's not bigger, but it's certainly more powerful because it is steam-powered. And it's got high technology artillery and other things, which is used in the Opium War. More reasons that we're poor, because our silver is suddenly flooding into England because of the smuggling of Western drugs into our country. Leading to the Opium War. This is a painting from the time. And you see over here on the right, British battleships blowing traditional Chinese ships to smithereens. Notice the British ships don't have sails. They don't need sail. They've got steam, much faster, right? Mechanical. And a painting of the Treaty of Nanking, which said, give us everything that McCartney asked for, basically. And you said no to back then because you can't say no anymore. It was at gunpoint, literally. This leads to the establishment of the concessions, or the treaty ports they are called. You know, many of you have been to many of them. Shanghai was a treaty port. It was a nothing little town until the Treaty of Nanking in 1843. which allowed foreigners to come and settle in China, little mini colonies. And they built their British architecture along the Bund and all that sort of thing. So Shanghai is an expat businessman's and missionaries' neighborhood. Because of the extraterritoriality, they had every right to put things like this up. Extraterritoriality, we're above your law. You can't do anything to us. We have Shanghai. We control our concessions, our areas. You don't. We have our law. We have our police. We have our infrastructure. We have our tax collection system, everything. The Chinese are living there, but the Chinese are not allowed. They're little mini colonies. That's what concessions means. So no dogs and Chinese allowed. This is probably not historically true, but the sort of urban myth of it spread. People believe it's true. And so to the Chinese, when they heard rumors of signs being put up in foreigners, expat bubble parks, no dogs or Chinese allowed, the already present anti-foreign sentiment only got worse. This is a picture of the glorious, glorious summer palace built under Qianlong for his mother, designed by Western architects, Jesuit architects, on the model of Versailles of King Louis XIV, the Sun King. After the Second Opium War, Lord Elgin almost burns down the Forbidden City to teach the Chinese a lesson after the Second Opium War. But he's persuaded, thank God, by a French guy, no, go burn this one down instead. Don't burn down the palace. That's too humiliating. So they burned down this exquisite summer palace built by Europeans. And the ruins are a national park for the Chinese today. If I had time, I would show you a movie in which the Chinese are asking Americans, why did you do this? And it is an American documentarian who's asking the questions to Chinese tourists looking at the ruins of the summer palace. They have not forgotten this. It took it 3 months to stop burning. They plundered it, they yada yada. So, okay, so the foreigners are in now. The merchants are in. The bottom of the spam now has free legal rights to do whatever they want to do because Chinese law does not apply to us. This is, to me, a really, really disgusting historical photograph. This is a cigarette advertisement, an American cigarette advertisement. So let's start marketing cigarettes. Let's just plaster billboards all along China's Grand Canal with advertisements to, smoke Marlboro. Humiliating, especially when you consider that it's merchants who are doing all these things in a civilization that really doesn't want consumerism, but they have no power to keep it out. Are the Qing weak even after the 2 Opium Wars? Well, no, because there's a revolt over here in the Muslim areas in Xinjiang, and the Qing army puts it down. There's a revolt over here in the Nian area, and the Qing army puts it down. And of course, there is the Taiping Rebellion. A lot of people say the Qing were weak. People that know about the fact that they were able to, all in the 60s and 50s, put down 3 different revolts. That belies the opinion that the Qing were weak. Their army was powerful enough. Yeah?
But doesn't it show that they're pretty weak that it took them 15 years to suppress both of the rebellions?
Definitely the Hangzhou Chuan one. The Nian Rebellion, yeah. Does it show that they're weak? It shows that things are going to hell in a handbasket, but I suppose the counter-argument is, yeah, but they did ultimately have the resources to actually win. Yeah, it took a long time. Weakening, I think we can meet at weakening, but so forth. There's Hangzhou Chuan having his vision, psychotic episode or dream, depending on your interpretation, in which God and Jesus tell him to fight the demonic Manchus. You see the demon there? And to destroy idols and all that sort of thing, which, being a monotheist, he does, because the first commandment says don't worship idols, and so they start destroying Chinese temples and all that sort of thing. And when we look at Mao, this is really interesting. causing devastation all throughout this area, and again, especially in China's breadbasket, the Yangtze River area. Treaty ports. By the time the Japanese win, there are over 20 ports. Foreigners are allowed. The Japanese say, not only are you going to let us import, export, and live there, you're going to let us build factories there and hire cheap labor. Remember that. Because a lot of people say that what China did after Mao died was basically return to this and give the Westerners everything they want. Hire cheap labor. Hire cheap Chinese labor. You know that's where your iPhones come from. Cheap Chinese labor. And most of your Walmart goods and so forth. There's a picture of Perry's arrival in Japan. What does this mark? Japan being the superpower of Asia from this point on, and China no longer being it. The Empress Sushi, a concubine who rose to power. There are biographies about her. She's incredibly interesting, and the things she had to deal with. This is one of the High Qing officials, yada yada. And here you see Japanese over here, on this side, dressed in their Western clothes. This is after the Treaty of Shimonoseki at the end of the Sino-Japanese War, where you've got all the Europeans and Japan, Westernized Japan, sitting at a table, forcing terms on the very unhappy Mandarins sitting on this side, modern and traditional. Stay with me here. This is really important because this starts in the Qing, but it continues into the ROC. This term, spheres of influence. After Japan defeated China and took Japanese purple, took Manchuria, there started what was called the scramble of China, the scramble for concessions. All of the other Western powers were like, oh hell, Japan's starting to take stuff, we need to go and take some territory too. And so, color-coded, Germany took, those of you going to interim with me, Chufu, and the area of Shandong where Confucius was born. Germany colonized that. The French took the areas down close to their new colony, Indochina. The British, of course, took the most wealthy Yangtze area, and also Canton, because the British were there first. The Russians are suddenly a threat up north. And notice the British took Tibet. Those of you who are interested in current Tibetan things, from the Chinese point of view, oh yeah, free Tibet? Well, look what happened the last time Tibet was free. The British came in and took it. And that's uphill from our empire. That's uphill from our country. All they got to do is just invade from Tibet. It's a much more complicated situation than your free Tibet activists let on. What about America during all this time? America had a different view of what to do in this scramble for concessions. Everybody was afraid that China would cause a war between all the imperial powers, just like Africa, right? They all took parts of Africa. There's only 5% of Africa left free in 1900. Europeans took every single bit of it, except for 5% of that entire continent. And just as in Africa, the Europeans were like, oh, this is going to lead to war unless we learn how to colonize without fighting and conflicting. In the same way, that's what they were doing here. They didn't want to start a war. They just wanted to exploit China. America, not having a colony, said, will you allow an open door policy? Can we just go in all of the areas, but sort of respect your sphere of influence there? The term sphere of influence. You want to be educated, yada, yada. It's not hard. And so America was allowed sort of carte blanche. They could do whatever they want in any of these places. Leading to this very famous political cartoon, The Carving Up of China. You see the traditional Chinese throwing up their hands saying, stop, stop, as you see cartoon images of all of the different European powers carving up the pie of China. The Japanese, the Russian, the German, Queen Victoria, and the French, Lady Liberty. Ironically enough, Lady Liberty. Give us a slice of the Free Chinese. Missionary activity starts after the Second Opium War. Missionary activity starts being legal in China. And so we have pictures of them. Here they are, teaching their gospel to the Chinese, in Chinese, dressed as Ricci dressed, rather Chinesey. Missionaries' wives start anti-foot binding campaigns and all sorts of things like that. Fascinating stuff. There's our missionary's wife. Missionaries were not as humane as you would expect them to have been. As this caption tells you, missionary justice, according to this photo's caption, the missionaries had tied up this thief to stew in the sun for a few days. A typical instance, typical, not unusual, instance of Christian missions taking justice into their own hands. Why did they rip nuns limb from limb? Because they weren't always being treated in the most benevolent way by the missionaries. Until finally, this is a picture of a boxer placard sign posted. And this is a translation of what it says. Look at that. Notice, the patriots of all the provinces, seeing that men of the West offend heaven in their behavior, offend Tien, have decided to assemble on the 15th day of the fourth moon and to kill the Westerners and burn their houses. This was posted on Confucian temples throughout the Yellow River and the Central Plain. Those whose hearts, those Chinese whose hearts are not in accord with us, are scoundrels and women of bad character. Those who read this announcement and fail to spread the news deserve the same characterization. Enough, no more words are needed. Clearly the last straws are starting to break. This is Baron von Kettler. In Beijing, the German ambassador. Baron von Kettler was murdered in Beijing because Baron von Kettler had taken a Chinese servant boy, raped him and killed him. And the Chinese knew about this. And this was a 7 or 8-year-old boy. And the Chinese knew this. And so the Chinese murdered this man in the streets of Beijing. He was the ambassador to China from Germany. It was the first event in the Boxer Uprising. The expats in Beijing were terrified because Boxers started coming and surrounding their neighborhoods and surrounding their churches. And so this is the summer of 1900, and this is what it looked like. This could be a businessman, a Western businessman in his house. This could be a Western merchant, missionary, or diplomat in their house. And they found themselves in the summer of 1900 in the biggest headline news. It lasted for 2 months, besieged by angry peasant boxers who were convinced that bullets could not go through them because they were magically protected through their martial arts rituals. And they're putting themselves up with sandbags and they're shooting at the people, angry locals, outside of their homes. They cannot leave their homes. They're worried that water and food are going to run out because it did drag into 8 weeks. Other people, do I have it? Yeah, here's a nice picture. What about the Chinese converts themselves? They were holed up in a cathedral in Beijing, terrified because the Boxers wanted to kill the Chinese converts too. And in fact, they killed more Chinese converts to Christianity than they did Westerners themselves. And so missionaries took all their Chinese converts and they holed up in a massive cathedral in Beijing. And the whole world was watching. Yeah.
What was their claim against the Chinese converts? Like, why were they against them?
They were, as your textbook did say, running to the missionaries anytime a Chinese legal conflict would break out, Oh, I owe this guy money. I don't want to pay him. Oh, I'm a mafioso or a thief or something like that. I don't want to be arrested. I'll go convert to Christianity. Oh, I'm hungry. They feed people. I'll go convert to Christianity. Whatever. As soon as I convert to Christianity, extraterritoriality. Missionaries are not under Chinese law. I can be protected, a Chinese person. All I got to do is convert, and the missionary will stand up and go, you can't touch our church or the people in it, this sort of thing. And so this caused massive, massive conflict between local Chinese traditional people and local Chinese Christian converts. Think about it for 2 minutes. Think about those who converted sincerely. I'm an 18-year-old boy. I talked to a Western missionary. He converted me to Christianity. I come home and say, Dad, I've discovered God. I can't bow to you anymore. I can't kowtow. On and on and on. Think of the domestic conflict that would happen every time a family saw one of its members become Christian. They can't do anything that the Christians say is idolatry or sinful or anything at all. So there were all sorts of reasons for the Chinese to be angry with this. The last one, which is really interesting, is this. There's a poem in which the Boxers wrote about the temples of the Chinese causing famine, drought, and flood. The weather is bad. China's sorrow, right? Drought or flood. And it's the Christians' fault that it didn't rain this summer. It's the Christians' fault that it rained too much this summer and we had a flood. And do you know what they blamed it on? Look at the Forbidden City and look at the architecture. This is the most interesting thing in the world. Notice my hand. I'm rushing through this. I'd love to play dentist and try to pull the answers out of you, but I'm lecturing. Chinese architecture is horizontal. It tries to blend in with nature because yin and yang are all very balanced things, and we certainly don't want to build high and to tian, sky, heaven, right? We don't want to penetrate heaven, sky, because that's part of the order, the yin, the yang, the seasons, all of that stuff, whose order we rely on to cause rain at the right time, and not too much, and not too little, so that we can eat every year, and all sort of thing. And Christians come in and they build their cathedrals. Architecturally, those things are the opposite. They don't harmonize with nature, they try to dominate it. We're going to put a steeple, it's going to be the highest thing you can see. The cross will be on top of it. The Chinese saw that, and they were like, that is a knife being stabbed into the belly of Tian. And they wrote poems about this, right? How disturbed they were. They're disrupting yin and yang and all this sort of thing through their simple architecture. Right? Does that make sense? In any case, yeah, it made the headlines. And it led to the ultimate humiliation. 8 countries coming into China. Chasing the Empress Dowager Cixi out of China and occupying the Forbidden City, the 8-nation expeditionary force, 7 European/American nations in Japan. And they occupied the Forbidden City, and they looted it, and they urinated in it, and they disrespected it, and they stole things. And when you go to Western museums in Paris, in Manhattan, in London, and you see the Chinese treasures, it's because they were stolen during this period, because this was the palace. This was where all of the artworks of China were. And so all of the masterpieces of Chinese art, well, how the hell did they get into Paris? How the hell did they get into London, right? They were stolen and sold. This is a contemporary issue in the art world, for those of you who... The Chinese are trying to get their treasures back to end the century of humiliation. Mark Twain was alive at this time. Huck Finn. Mark Twain wrote several essays, you can Google them, they're fascinating, in which he, like many people when Bush invaded Iraq, many people were dissonant, right? They were saying this is absolutely wrong, and they were attacked for it, right? How dare you say we shouldn't attack Saddam? Well, Mark Twain was that in the Boxer period, and he wrote a famous essay called I Am a Boxer. This is the aftermath of the Boxer Uprising. There are some American soldiers occupying the Forbidden City. I was in the army. I can only imagine what they did. Search and destroy missions. We got to find those boxers. Like in Vietnam, when we did search and destroy missions against the Vietnamese, we went into villages of farmers, rice farmers, and grass huts with their families, and we burned their rice huts down with our cigarette lighters in the Vietnam War. Search and destroy, one of the big shames of American history. We did the same thing to the villages around Beijing. Anybody who was like young and male was a suspected terrorist or boxer and captured. There's a picture. Very interesting. Jae-young's always sleepy. Very interesting. And so without energy that he can't even look at. Yeah, this is recorded Jae-young, by the way. It's my evidence. Can't even look at a freaking screen. This is an Indian, a Bengali, that the British forced to come and fight in China. Standing next to two captured, quote, boxers. So the Chinese are rounded up. They're tried in front of, we have to, in front of Chinese magistrates. And they're beheaded by the thousands. Historical photographs, yeah.
Like in the book, it said that the Qing initially supported the boxers, but then they were forced to, like in the treaty at the end, like to like basically go against the boxers and to try them. But then, and like the West supported that. But how come the West like continued to support the Qing even after they had supported the boxers during the rebellion?
Because as long as the Qing is weak, we can do anything we want. You've heard the saying, better the devil that you do know than the devil that you don't know. As long as we can keep the Qing propped up, in power, but not strong enough to resist us, that's the easiest thing in the world. We can continue doing everything we're doing. If there's a revolution, who knows what's going to happen. Sense of humiliation again. The guy who raped that kid and was shot in the streets of Beijing, in the Boxer Protocol and the Boxer Treaty, Germany insisted that China build a monument to him. And there it is. There's a monument in Beijing to the child molester. This is all, I can show you the books. I'm not making this stuff up. And most importantly of all, and I think this is, well, almost the last slide. Most importantly of all, looking forward to the Republic of China. A man standing next to $1 trillion. The 450 million taels or silver dollars of indemnity that the 8 nations insisted China pay. 450 million. They insisted they pay it over the next 4 decades. Banks are ecstatic because China has to borrow money from Western banks to pay Western countries. And the banks get interest, and the Western governments get payment, and this is required for the next 4 decades. 450 million silver dollars demanded in 1900. David D. did the math last year. It's $1 trillion over 40 years. The Qing will fall 12 years later in 1912. This happened in 1900. The payments are still required for the entire Republic of China until Japan invades in World War II. So the 8 Western countries plus Japan, they're getting payments all the way through poor Chiang Kai-shek's Republican attempt to like make a new government. His revenues are being drained. One country did not. One country of the 8 that demanded this money, this is interesting. One country that demanded, of the 8 that demanded this money in the indemnities and got payments every year, only one country, did I tell you? During the Republic of China said, you know, the other 7, they're still getting their payments every month. They're still totally, we forfeit them. You don't have to pay us anymore. Anybody want to guess which country that was? And the Chinese loved them. Anybody want to guess which country that was? The Soviet Union. The communists. The brand new communist country that overthrew Russia. They needed allies. They looked at China because it's the first communist country on the planet, the Soviet Union, Russia. They're surrounded by capitalist countries that don't want communism to succeed. They're terrified of being strangled, invaded, destroyed. And they're looking at China and saying, this is really interesting because they've got a political vacuum. The Qing has fallen. And they have choices to make. Are they going to go capitalist? Are they going to go communist? How can we make them interested in us? And Vladimir Lenin says, China, you don't have to pay us anymore. This made all the capitalist countries look really horrible. Pulling this back, 1700, early Qing, European GDP, Asian GDP. Very interesting. At what point does it start going up? When the opium trade starts smuggling tens of thousands of chests into China in 1820, 1840, First Opium War, 1860, Second Opium War, and Europe and America eclipse China in terms of economic power. And this is the world when China falls. All of those colors are colonies of the West in the age of imperialism. Notice China is white only because those spheres of influence are still there, but none of them colonized China. They just had a weak government. So hear this. Looking forward into the Republic of China, the Chinese still have these British in Shanghai. They still have these British in Canton. They still have the Germans in Qingdao. They still got all the Westerners from the Qing era still in their country. They call them imperialists. They want them out. But they're so powerful, it's hard to get them out. Done. Now let me save the... Do you have any questions?